Let us begin our analysis by deconstructing the Sannyasi and Fakir rebellions, which occurred between 1763 and 1800. This is not just a random uprising. It represents a unique sociological phenomenon where the spiritual world collided with harsh economic realities. Usually, we assume religious ascetics, sannyasis and fakirs are detached from worldly affairs, right? तो सवाल ये है कि इन्होंने हथियार क्यों उठाए? The primary catalyst here was the disastrous famine of 1770. This famine was not merely a food shortage, it was a demographic collapse where nearly one-third of the population perished. British policies, instead of providing relief, intensified revenue extraction. Simultaneously, the British imposed strict restrictions on pilgrim visits to holy sites. For a sannyasi or a fakir, pilgrimage is not leisure, it is an essential part of their existence. When you block that, you attack their core identity. Now look closely at the sociological composition involved here. It wasn't just monks fighting alone. As shown in the alliance of the dispossessed concept, three distinct groups merged. First, the religious ascetics, who had mobility and martial training. Second, the disbanded soldiers and zamindars, who had lost their lands and status due to British policies. And third, the peasantry suffering from high taxation. जब ये तीनों मिले, तब resistance fierce हुआ. This created a unique guerrilla force. They didn't fight open battles, they used guerrilla skirmishes, raiding company factories and treasuries in northern Bengal and Bihar. Leaders like Majnu Shah and later Devi Chaudhrani utilized the terrain effectively. Although Warren Hastings eventually suppressed this through protracted military action, the psychological impact was immense. This rebellion etched itself into the cultural memory of Bengal, eventually finding its way into literature. Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay's novel Anand Math is based on this very revolt. Remember, Vande Mataram emerges from this context, a cry of the dispossessed fighting for their land and faith against an alien economic power. So understand this as an economic war fought under a religious banner. Moving south to the Polygar rebellions, 1795 to 1805, we witness a structural clash between a decentralized traditional authority and a centralized colonial state. To understand this, you must first grasp the Polygar system or Palaya Karars. In the traditional South Indian system, a polygar was not just a landlord, he was a sovereign military chief controlling a territory called Palayam. They had the right to collect taxes and, crucially, the right to collect kaval fees, which were fees for policing and protection. Basically, they were the state at a local level. Now, enter the East India Company. The British administration could not tolerate parallel centers of power. They demanded two things: disarmament of the polygars and the abolition of their right to collect kaval. देखो, जब आप किसी रूलर से उसकी आर्मी और टैक्स कलेक्शन का अधिकार छीन लेते हो, तो आप उसे रूलर से महर जमींदार बना रहे हो. This erosion of authority triggered the conflict. The resistance unfolded in two phases. The first phase, 1799, was led by Veera Pandya Kattaboman. His conflict started over a revenue dispute, but fundamentally it was a refusal to accept British suzerainty. He refused to bow down to the collector, leading to his capture and hanging. But the movement didn't die with him. The second phase, 1800 to 1801, was even more significant because it showed political maturity. Marudu Pandyan formed the South Indian Confederacy, uniting diverse leaders like Gopala Nayak and Kerala Varma. They issued the Tiruchirappalli Proclamation, which was essentially a manifesto calling for anti-British unity across caste and creed. This was rare for that time. The British response was brutal suppression, ending with the Carnatic Treaty of 1801. Note the term liquidated polygar system. The treaty didn't just end the war, it dismantled the entire feudal structure, converting these proud military chiefs into mere landholders or zamindars, forever stripping them of their political and military power. Now,
focus on the Paika Rebellion of 1817 in Odisha. Often, history books label uprisings as simply peasant revolts, but the Paika Rebellion is structurally different. The Paikas were a traditional landed militia, foot soldiers who provided military service to the king of Horda during war. In return, they enjoyed rent-free lands known as Nishkan Mahals. This was a symbiotic relationship between the state and its soldiers. However, the British conquest of Odisha in 1803 shattered this ecosystem. The British classified these tax-free lands as taxable territories. Suddenly, a soldier who never paid rent was being extorted for land revenue. But the economic strangulation went deeper than just land. Look at the currency crisis. The local economy operated on cowrie shells, a traditional currency. The British demanded revenue payment in silver. Samjo isko. If a peasant has savings in cowrie and the government declares cowrie worthless, his entire wealth evaporates overnight. This devaluation of savings, combined with a salt monopoly that raised prices of an essential commodity, pushed the population to the brink. It was a total economic collapse. The leader, Bakshi Jagabandhu, was the military commander of the Raja of Horda. When the rebellion broke out, it wasn't a mob, it was a coordinated military offensive. They attacked symbols of colonial power, police stations, treasuries, and administrative centers like Banpur. The involvement of the Kond tribes and zamindars shows a cross-sectional unity. Although the uprising was suppressed by 1825, its intensity forced the British to recognize it as a significant challenge. It is crucial to see the Paika Rebellion not just as a reaction to tax, but as a defense of a traditional military hierarchy and dignity that the British administration completely failed to understand. The transition from a service-based tenure to a cash-based revenue system destroyed the social fabric of Odisha.
Let us analyze the resistance from the princely states, specifically focusing on the mechanism of the subsidiary alliance trap. This slide visualizes a specific cycle of decline for Indian rulers. It usually starts with a treaty promising protection. Step 2 is the stationing of a subsidiary force, the cost of which creates a financial burden on the prince. This leads to Step 3, accumulation of arrears. When the state cannot pay, the British resident starts interfering in internal administration. Step 4, eventually leading to annexation. This is the structural context for the revolts in Travancore and Kittur. Take the case of Velu Thampi in Travancore 1808-09. He was the Dalava, Prime Minister. The burden of subsidiary alliance arrears imposed by Wellesley was suffocating the state, but Velu Thampi went a step further than most. He issued the Kundara Proclamation in 1809. इसका significance बहुत high है. Unlike other rulers who fought privately, this was an open call to arms to the common masses to protect their caste, religion, and state against foreigners. It transformed a state grievance into a mass resistance. Similarly, in Kittur, Karnataka, 1824, we see the precursor to the doctrine of lapse. Queen Kittur Channamma adopted an heir after her husband's death. The British refused to recognize this adoption to seize control. This was a direct attack on the sovereignty and succession rights of the state. Channamma's resistance and later the guerrilla war by Sangoli Rayyanna highlights that these were not just fights for money but for political survival. These revolts, Velu Thampi and Kittur Channamma, represent the branch B in our flowchart. Instead of submitting to annexation, they chose to revolt. They were defending their right to exist as sovereign entities against an administrative encroachment that sought to turn them into mere pensioners of the company.
We now shift our lens to the tribal uprisings, the Kols, Santhals, Khassis, and Bhils. To understand these, you must understand the concept of penetration. Tribal geographies were historically isolated and self-governing. The British administration broke this isolation by introducing dikus, outsiders like moneylenders and traders, into these protected zones. Look at the cycle of exploitation infographic. It starts with the monetization of the tribal economy. The British demanded taxes in cash. Tribals who had no cash were forced to go to the moneylender, the diku. The moneylender charged exorbitant interest, leading to a debt trap. When the tribal couldn't pay, the moneylender seized his land alienation. This forced the tribal into migration or bonded labor. This cycle generated intense agrarian fear and anger. For the Kols in Chota Nagpur, 1831, the trigger was the transfer of their land to outsiders. They responded by burning the farms of moneylenders, targeting the economic agents of their misery. The Santhal Hul, 1855–56, was even more organized. Leaders Sido and Kanhu didn't just fight, they proclaimed that company rule had ended. They were fighting the nexus of the police, the moneylender, and the zamindar. In the northeast, the Khasi Revolt in 1829 under Tirot Singh had a slightly different cause. It was triggered by a road construction project connecting Brahmaputra to Sylhet. This project brought in outsiders and forced labor, Begar, which the Khasis viewed as an encroachment on their territorial integrity. Similarly, the Bhils in the Western Ghats feared agrarian hardship and British annexation. In all these cases, the underlying theme is the clash between a community-based resource management system and a colonial, extractive, private property-based legal system. The tribals were not just fighting for land, they were fighting to preserve their entire way of life against an alien legal and economic order that criminalized their traditional existence.
This section addresses peasant movements, specifically the Pagalpanthis, Faraizi, and Mopla uprisings. A key pattern here is the nature of movements. You will notice a shift. These movements often began as religious reform movements but evolved into agrarian struggles. Why does this happen? Because in the feudal structure, the class hierarchy often aligned with religious identities. Look at the hierarchical pyramid of the agrarian exploitation. At the top is the British state demanding revenue. Below them are the zamindars or planters, and at the bottom is the peasantry, riots. In eastern Bengal, the peasantry was largely Muslim, while the landlords were often Hindu or aligned with British planters. So when leaders like Karam Shah, Pagalpanthis, or Dudu Mian, Faraizi, preached religious purity, they inevitably touched upon the economic oppression of their followers. The Faraizi doctrine, land belongs to Allah, is a brilliant example of this. अगर ज़मीन अल्लाह की है, तो ज़मींदार टैक्स लेने वाला कौन होता है? This theological argument provided a justification to refuse rent payment. It gave the peasants a moral high ground to defy the tax hierarchy. They organized paramilitary forces, lathials, to physically resist the indigo planters. Similarly, in the Malabar South, the Mopla uprisings of 1836–54 involved Muslim cultivators, Moplas, rising against Hindu upper caste landlords, Genghis, and the British. The causes were purely agrarian, hike in revenue, insecurity of tenure, and eviction, but the mobilization was religious. It creates a religious agrarian nexus. You cannot separate the faith from the fight here because the exploiter and the exploited belonged to different communities. Therefore, these movements must be understood as class struggles expressed through the language of religion. The British and zamindars were seen not just as economic oppressors but as disruptors of the divine order.
The Wahhabi movement, or the Waliola movement, represents the most organized and sustained challenge to British authority in the pre-1857 era. Unlike the localized peasant revolts we discussed earlier, this was a pan-Indian network with a distinct ideological foundation. Inspired by Shah Waliullah and popularized by Syed Ahmed of Raebareli, the core goal was to convert Dar-ul-Harb, land of infidels, into Dar-ul-Islam, land of Islam. This ideology provided a relentless drive for recruitment and funding. Structurally, this movement was fascinating. Look at the Wahhabi supply chain map. They had a base of operations in Sithana, in the northwest frontier province, or tribal belt, which is geographically very far from their recruitment grounds in Bengal and Bihar. Yet, they maintained a constant flow of men and money. How? Through the organizational structure shown in the tree diagram. They established a sophisticated hierarchy. At the top was the spiritual head. Below him was the Sithana command. Crucially, they appointed caliphas, or spiritual vice-regents, in major cities like Patna, Malda, and Hyderabad. Patna acted as the operational HQ and funding hub. These caliphas managed local agents who collected funds and recruited volunteers. It functioned almost like a parallel government or a shadow state. Initially, their target was the Sikhs in Punjab, but after the British annexed Punjab in 1949, their full fury turned against the British. The British eventually had to launch extensive military campaigns in the 1860s and conduct the famous sedition trials in Ambala and Patna to dismantle this network. The Wahhabi movement proves that resistance wasn't always spontaneous. It could be deeply ideological, geographically expansive, and bureaucratically organized. It showed the British that they were sitting on a volcano of organized dissent that spanned the entire subcontinent.
Finally, we arrive at the critical analysis of the nature and limitations of pre-1857 uprisings. When we study these revolts, whether Sannyasi, Polygar, or Santhal, we must ask, what was their character? The radar chart effectively visualizes this. Notice the geographical reach is low. These movements were localized. They were isolated in space and time. A Santhal in Bengal did not know about a Polygar in Tamil Nadu. There was no pan-Indian national consciousness. Secondly, look at the ideology axis. It tilts towards restorationist. This means they were backward-looking. They wanted to restore the old feudal order, the old zamindars and traditional rulers. They were not fighting for a modern, democratic, egalitarian society. They were fighting to go back to the past. The leadership was semi-feudal, displaced chieftains and religious heads, not the modern middle-class intellectual that would later lead the freedom struggle. The Anatomy of Resistance infographic highlights the technological gap. You see the traditional warrior with a sword and shield? He is fighting against the British Enfield rifles and artillery. This primitive weaponry was a massive weakness. However, despite these limitations, their strengths cannot be ignored. The mass participation was immense. They demonstrated that the Indian peasant and tribal could sacrifice everything for their dignity. These uprisings bridged Hindu-Muslim divides locally, as seen in the Sannyasi Fakir rebellion. Most importantly, their significance lies in the fact that they exposed the unpopularity of alien rule. They shattered the myth that British rule was accepted by the masses. They established a tradition of resistance. These were the tremors before the earthquake. They created the psychological and physical environment of defiance that eventually culminated in the Great Revolt of 1857. So, while they failed individually due to lack of coordination and modern ideology, they succeeded in keeping the spirit of resistance alive.